People love to talk about anime. They talk about plot, characters, even workspace conditions, but there's one aspect that seems to escape most conversations: the soundtrack. Music and sound design are a central part of any media. It creates tension and emotion, and it can even add additional meaning and depth to the media. And in some cases, it can go as far as to make or break the product. And anime is no exception. Music and sound effects are a necessity in creating intriguing shows. And when a ton of effort is put into the sound design, it can really elevate a show. A great example of this is Kill la Kill. On its own, Kill la Kill is still a decent anime. It has a kind of intriguing story, and the animation quality is pretty good all the way through. But it's not really anything that special. It's just kind of okay. But it's the soundtrack that really helps create these emotional moments. Part of what makes this soundtrack so successful is its depth. There's a wide variety of tracks that are used throughout the show, and you can tell that some of them were crafted for specific scenes and characters. I think the most perfect example of this is Aragio's theme. The regality of her theme fits her character perfectly, and it's just one of the examples that I could share that shows the care that went into crafting this soundtrack. However, it is also possible for a soundtrack to weaken a show. The best example I have of this is Tokyo Revengers. Tokyo Revengers overall is once again a pretty decent anime. The characters are somewhat interesting, the story is cool, but the soundtrack is so shallow you can mistake it for one of my exes from high school. I'm just kidding. I didn't date anyone in high school. Anyway, as I was saying, Tokyo Revengers has maybe 5 tracks in total. And while they're fine tracks on their own, the fact that the number is so limited means that certain tracks are forced to be overused or used inappropriately. And I'm not saying this necessarily ruins the show, but there are some moments that don't feel quite as suspenseful or quite as rewarding as they normally would be, because we've already heard the soundtracks so many times that we can practically already guess what's gonna happen next. For instance, this theme has been used so many times to build tension that it's just almost annoying to hear by the end of the show. Like I said earlier, this doesn't necessarily ruin the show, but in the modern age of anime, when so many shows have very compelling soundtracks, it just leaves a lot to be desired. As I briefly mentioned earlier, a soundtrack can add a lot of depth to a show, and I wanted to expand on that a little bit. There are 2 major ways this is done. The first is through character themes. Character themes are basically what they sound like. It's a piece of music that's dedicated to a specific character. A show that does a great job of this is Attack on Titan. A lot of the major titans each have their own themes. The Colossal Titan has Appleseed. The Armored Titan has You See Big Girl. And the female Titan has, well, whatever this is. There are quite a few different shows that do this, and I think the more you pay attention to a soundtrack, the more you'll notice themes like this. But there is another slightly more complicated way a soundtrack can add depth, and that is through motifs. A motif is a musical term for a set of notes or rhythms that have symbolic meaning. It's not too different from a character theme, except that instead of an entire song being dedicated to a character, it's usually a short series of notes or a short passage. This is very rare to find in anime. I haven't watched a ton of anime, but from what I have watched, I've only found one show that has done this, and that is Hunter x Hunter. Now, the motif that I'm talking about in this case belongs to Meruem, the king of the ants, and it sounds like this. This series of notes can be heard in like 3 or 4 tracks within the Chimera Ant arc. We hear it a lot in Elegy of the Dynast, as well as Into the Palace Lamentoso. But I think the most interesting place we can find this motif is in understanding. When understanding is introduced, it's used as the theme of the character Komugi. And if you listen to the climax of the piece, you can hear Merum's motif intertwined with the climax of the piece. This just goes to show the level of detail that went into this soundtrack, that they managed to use Merum's theme at the climax of Komugi's song. And it's an incredibly beautiful piece of symbolism that is easily missed by most viewers. Moments like this are why I want more people to talk about anime soundtracks. There's an entire another level of depth that can be obtained if you just listen closely. Alright, there's one last thing I want to talk about in terms of anime soundtracks, and that is orchestration. Orchestration is basically which instruments are used on a soundtrack. It's not usually a major player in what makes the soundtrack good, but there are a few shows that use this opportunity to elevate the soundtrack once again. And I think the most obvious example of this is the Attack on Titan soundtrack. The soundtrack of Attack on Titan is undoubtedly one of its most distinct characteristics. It uses a full orchestra and choir, while using much more modern instruments and electronic sounds at the same time. In a lot of cases, this might feel overwhelming. It might sound like a little bit messy or garbled with so many different voices and textures trying to mesh at once. But it fits really well with Attack on Titan. And part of that is that it's reflective of the show's steampunk aesthetics. This mix of classical techniques with modern techniques is reflective of how the show handles technology. This is even further accentuated by the Marley arc in Season 4. Marley is a more traditional society based on our world, and we can see that this is reflected once again in the soundtrack by the instrumentation, as most of the soundtrack relies on more classical instrumentation. This is a more niche example of how a soundtrack can help give depth to an anime, but it's still something that I think should be talked about since it's executed so well here. At the end of the day, people are going to talk about what they want to talk about. And if people don't want to talk about soundtracks, that's okay. But I do wish they would get a bit more credit when it comes to creating emotional and effective moments in anime. Thank you all for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, please subscribe and let me know what your favorite soundtrack is in the comments down below. Thank you again, and I'll see you next week.